My name is Sam Whitaker. I am 54 years old, and for nearly 3 decades, I coordinated maritime rescue operations across the North Atlantic. That morning, I walked into the conference room with the same mindset I always had at the start of storm season. I figured we were reviewing the hurricane response plan, updating the helicopter rotation, maybe checking whether the weather models had shifted since last week. I even brought my old leather notebook, ready to mark down areas that might need new warnings. But the moment the door clicked shut behind me, I knew something was off. The HR manager sat upright, like she was about to read a verdict. In front of her was a light brown cardboard box, the kind anyone who has spent long enough in public service can recognize from across the room. She slid the box toward me and spoke in that polished tone people develop after hundreds of procedural explanations. I looked at the box, then at the way she avoided my eyes, and let out a small laugh. I told her I recognized that box model. They had been buying those things in bulk since 1999. She froze for half a second, but kept the official expression she had practiced for days like this. I did not bother asking questions. When you have spent 30 years inside an agency, you learn to look at the box before you look at the reason. And the reason is almost always the same. The door opened again, and in walked the new guy, Evan Caldwell. Hair neatly combed, shirt crisp, walked with that confident pace of someone more familiar with lecture halls than storm decks. 29 years old, Harvard Kennedy School, the rising star the board believed would bring a modern perspective to maritime rescue. He stepped in with a polite smile, the kind that makes you wonder if it comes from confidence or pure naivety. Evan shook my hand, still smiling, while his eyes scanned the room as if measuring whether it was big enough for the wall-to-wall monitors he planned to install. He spoke clearly, every word carrying that quiet pride people get from degrees with embossed seals. He repeated what the board told him, that our rescue division needed a comprehensive data-driven approach, and that his new coordination system would be set up by this afternoon. I nodded. Young folks love their innovations, and I am old enough to know everyone deserves their chance. What I was not sure about was whether that chance could still keep people alive out there. I pulled the cardboard box closer and started packing. First thing in was my black leather logbook, 28 years of storms living in those pages. I flipped one open. Pencil marks are fading, but every line is still burned into memory. Notes on the 2009 current shift. A hand-drawn reef chart that an old fisherman gave me. The strange westward wind from the 2014 winter storm forced the helicopter to reroute. None of that was in any textbook, and it was not the kind of data Harvard could compute. It came from eyes that had watched the ocean change color before a storm, from ears that recognized the offbeat tremble of a distress horn in thick fog, and from nights standing in front of grieving families wondering if I could have done more. I set the logbook in the box, added a few team photos, a small seashell a rescued kid once gave me, and a folded map my wife packed 22 years ago. My fingers lingered on that map. Storm of 2003, the cold that night that sliced across my face like needles when the sea spray hit. She was on that survey trip with me. She never came home. That kind of loss never fades. You just tuck it into a different drawer of the heart. The way I tuck that map away now. Evan kept talking with HR about reorganizing the radar displays while I lifted the box, lighter than the weight of 28 years this room carried. I looked at Evan one last time. No anger, no resentment, just the quiet recognition of someone about to do a job whose consequences he had not even glimpsed yet. I used to be young too. I remember that kind of blindness. I walked out. The hallway felt longer than usual, neon lights bouncing off the walls, making everything colder. When I stepped through the main doors, the sea wind hit my face, salt, algae, and that sharp morning chill that felt like someone whispering my name from an old storm. I paused, staring at the distant waves, wondering if my wife would have agreed with me leaving today. I think she would have nodded. She used to tell me that sometimes silence is the strongest answer. I checked my watch. 48 minutes since I had walked into that room. Not long enough to be angry, just long enough to understand that the entire system had pushed itself closer to danger. I did not argue, did not cry, did not plead. I simply walked away. They could take my desk, but they could not take 30 years of experience out of their own heads. And they sure as hell could not take the ocean out of me. Before I continue, tell me this. Which state are you listening from? Comment below so I know. I left the NACR headquarters that morning with the box in my hands and an emptiness in my chest that I did not fully feel until I stepped back into my own home. When I set the box down on the kitchen table, I opened the lid and looked at what was inside. The old map my wife once folded, a few photos of the rescue team grinning in the sun, and the black leather logbook with the worn edges. I rested my hand on the cover, and 28 years of memories rose up like waves. First gentle, then spaced closer, then crashing all at once. I did not start my life in maritime rescue as a respected coordinator. I started with a job far harsher, a mechanic on a rescue vessel. Back then, I was barely in my 20s, hair long, temper even longer, and had not yet learned the patience the ocean forces into anyone who stays long enough. I was responsible for keeping those engines alive, no matter how hard the wind hit, no matter how much seawater flooded the machinery, no matter how the storm tried to tear the anchor loose. Those days in the engine bay were stifling hot, the roar never stopped, and no one ever saw you. No one even knew what you did, but if the engine died, the entire team died with it. I learned to understand the engine's pulse the same way you understand the breath of someone you love. Some days the sea shook the hull so violently it felt like it would split in half. I would still be crouched under that metal frame, tightening each bolt so it would not rip loose in the darkness. 3 years as a mechanic taught me every rhythm of the water in this region. When I moved up to coordination, I carried that same habit of listening closely. Never ignore the smallest sound on the radio. Rescue coordination is not just maps and commands. It is feeling the weight in a distress call, recognizing fear in the witness's tremble, knowing when a helicopter crew is lying to calm you and when they are truly afraid. 3 years, then 7 years, then 10 years. People began trusting me with the hardest judgment calls. The helicopter crews used to joke that they only felt safe when I was the one listening below. I still remember the rescue in the fog back in 2008. A squid boat was stranded in one of the thickest fogs I had ever seen. The air was so dense that the searchlights barely lit a few feet ahead. The crew had lost contact. GPS failed. Radio waves were a mess of static. I relied on local knowledge and wind direction to guess where they might have drifted. The helicopter team did not believe me at first. They called it listening to the heartbeat of the sea. But that 3-degree shift in the northwest wind brought them straight to the stalled vessel. When they dropped the line down, the captain's voice cracked with relief. The whole room went silent. I recorded every detail into the logbook. Every wind change, every minute, not to brag, but so the next time a boat slipped into the same nightmare, we would not be searching blind. But the rescue that haunts me most is the propeller dive in 2012. A young fisherman slipped and was pulled into the still spinning blades. By the time we arrived, the water was streaked red. There was no time to wait for the dive team. I tied the safety line around my waist and took one long breath and went down. The water was ice cold. The propeller still turning slowly but deadly enough to tear a body open. I had to crawl with my elbows until I reached him. The engine had been cut, thank God, but those blades were still a threat. I squeezed through a gap barely wider than a door crack, pulled him free, and pushed it upward as the crew shouted above. My hands were shaking when we laid him on the deck. He lived. And every Christmas since then, he sends me a box of homemade cookies. I wrote that one down too. Every one of them. Not for anyone else to read, but because no detail should ever disappear. A shift in wind can be the difference between life and death. That logbook is not just a notebook. It is a legacy, a second memory, a reminder that rescue work is not just a skill. It is discipline. It is respect for the sea. Over the years as coordinator, I built a bond with the radar station and the patrol units too. We worked long enough together that a single pause in their breathing over the radio told me exactly what was wrong. The helicopter crews knew my voice so well that whenever I hesitated for 2 seconds before giving an order, they would ask what I was calculating. And then there were the nights the ocean turned red in my memory. The night I lost my wife in 2003 is one of them. The survey vessel was hit by a sudden storm. I could not save her. I carried that pain the rest of my life. It made me swear that no one would ever die again because someone lacked real experience. Not while I could still stand on my own 2 feet and hear the sea change its breath. I looked at the logbook on the table and traced the faded ink with my finger. No matter what box they handed me today, they could never take these 28 years from me. And I knew that sooner or later the ocean would demand what I had learned, whether they believed algorithms could replace it or not. When night settled in, I was still sitting by the window staring at the ocean, but not to look for any weather signal. I just watched and let the day's thoughts drift with the waves. People often say that when you walk away from a job you have stayed in for too long, it feels like losing a limb. But to me, it felt more like stepping onto the sidewalk and watching a familiar train speed past without me on it. No pain, no regret, just curiosity about where that train would go next. A message from the field team lit up my phone. They sent a photo of the coordination room. Every screen was running the new interface with bright blue letters spelling out Blue Future 2.0. Under that title were moving graphs, heat maps, and blinking markers labeled as high-risk zones. At first glance, it looked futuristic enough, but something in that image made me laugh quietly. Not because it was funny, but because I knew this moment would come. Blue Future 2.0 was Evan Caldwell's new pride and joy. He presented it as a revolution in maritime rescue. The system used multivariable prediction models, real-time weather analytics, and hundreds of factors to estimate risk on each stretch of water. One look at it, and you might think it was about to change the entire New England coastline. Management loved it. They loved the way Evan presented it. He stood in front of the giant screen, pointing at red arrows sliding across the map, his voice clear and confident. People nodded nonstop as if every flicker of the chart was a scientific breakthrough. Evan knew how to perform. It was a skill worth admiring, and something sea people like us were never good at. I never said Evan wasn't smart. He absorbed data fast, memorized nearly every number in the 10-year reports. But being smart and understanding the ocean are two very different things. The waters off Maine do not behave according to charts. The currents along New England never stay steady long enough for a model to know what they will do next. And the wind here changes its mood as quickly as a hungry child. One afternoon, a helicopter captain sent me a short line. Blue Future 2.0 sounds like fancy bottled water. That is the kind of humor sea people use. Dry and sharp. None of them rejected new technology, but all of them knew rescue work could never depend on tech alone. They needed someone who knew these waters well enough to read depth from the color of the sea, judge fog density from the tone of a ship's horn, or feel the wind shift before the radar ever showed it. Evan stayed confident. Every morning he opened the Blue Future 2.0 dashboard, zoomed into the red patches, and ordered the helicopter crews to focus on those zones. He called it a scientific approach. The crews followed the instructions, but I knew they did not fully trust them. They were used to checking my judgment with a glance, and I was used to understanding them with a single breath over the radio. Now they had to follow theory instead of instinct. One day, Evan held an all-hands meeting explaining how Blue Future 2.0 predicted accident risk. He spent 30 minutes talking about reinforcement learning, parallel wave simulation models, and a dozen things that sounded like pure text to anyone who had stood on a storm deck. When he finished, the whole room clapped. But seconds later, a technician leaned to the helicopter captain and whispered just loud enough to catch on the recording. "Looks nice. Not sure if it can save anyone." Evan meant well. He was not arrogant. He simply believed science could cover everything. There is nothing wrong with that confidence, except when you apply it to the most unpredictable waters in the region, a place where winds go silent minutes before a storm breaks, where fog can swallow the horizon in a single breath. What worried me was not that Blue Future 2.0 could be wrong. It was that Evan did not know it could be wrong. A good rescuer always prepares for the moment every calculation betrays you. A young man who only knows theory believes the chart knows everything. I did not blame Evan, and I did not think his project was useless. Every generation has its own language. The only thing I knew for certain was that the bush Evan had been given did not live inside polished meetings. It lived out there on the water, where one wrong call could kill someone. And when the ocean speaks, it rarely gives warnings. I leaned back in my chair after reading the field team's message. Even though I was no longer inside NACR's walls, I could still feel the invisible thread tying me to that place. And I knew that sooner or later, what I predicted would happen. The sea would test Evan. And when that moment came, Blue Future 2.0 would not be what people reach for. They would reach for experience. And experience, even if placed in a cardboard box that morning, always finds its way back when it is needed. That night, just as I was making myself a cup of hot tea, the wind outside the window suddenly shifted. I was no longer working in the coordination room, but my body still reacted like someone on duty. Anyone who has spent enough years in rescue work carries a strange instinct. You can feel the ocean change its breath before the weather charts have time to turn red. I set the cup down, stepped onto the porch, and watched a streak of clouds cut across the sky above. They were moving too fast, faster than anything the forecast had mentioned that morning. About 2 hours later, my phone began ringing nonstop. I did not answer, but the text came in fast enough for me to understand what was happening. A storm had arrived 6 hours earlier than the prediction model. Radar was breaking, radio waves were cutting in and out. All the signs only someone who has lived enough years beside the sea can read with full clarity. Inside the coordination room, Evan stood in front of the screens, tense, but trying to look composed. I knew this from the internal radio recording a team member sent me afterward. Blue Future 2.0 was running a new prediction cycle, but every chart was lagging behind reality by several minutes. In rescue work, a few minutes can mean a life. Evan held on to the interface, trying to prove the curves on the screen were still trustworthy. The storm did not care about models. It just kept pushing wind, flipping boats, and tearing white spray off the surface. The helicopter team reported they were approaching a danger zone, but Evan told them to hold their course toward an area the model marked as safe. That was the moment I wished I still had a radio in my hand. Just by listening to the wind behind the static, I would have known they were heading straight into a reverse pressure pocket. Evan could not hear that shift. Human ears mattered more than machine ears. 5 minutes later, the pilot's voice burst through the recording. Rotor instability, strong gusts from the northwest, sudden drop in altitude. The cockpit turned chaotic. One of the crew shouted that they were being pulled toward a cold air vortex, half a degree off in their approach angle, and the helicopter could flip backward. In the coordination room, Evan clutched the table edge and kept asking, "Where is the model? Why did the model not warn us?" Reality does not wait for a model. The helicopter team survived only because the captain muted Central Command for a few seconds and followed his instincts. He swung the aircraft southeast, climbed into a higher wind corridor, and stabilized the rotor. A decision that went against Blue Future 2.0 entirely, completely. But it saved them. The relief in their voices nearly drowned out the storm. At the same time, emergency signals began pouring in from offshore. A small tourist boat with 4 people had capsized 12 nautical miles out. No positioning. 1 person swept away. 3 clinging to an overturned hull as the water. Temperature dropped by the minute. Blue Future 2.0 could not react. The radar feed was too scrambled. No real coordinates, no drift direction, no angle of rotation. For people in this line of work, that is the worst case you can face. The coordination room spiraled into disorder. 2 radio stations received conflicting instructions because Evan was relying on 2 parallel models that the system auto-generated when the radar weakened. One told them to head west, the other south. The rescue boats offshore had no idea which order to obey. The gap between those 2 directions was nearly 4 nautical miles, large enough for the victims to die of hypothermia before anyone reached them. Urgent voices overlapped nonstop. The helicopter pilot said the onboard radar was scrambled and demanded clear guidance. The patrol boat asked for a corrected wind direction. And Evan, according to the recording I heard later, tried explaining that the model would adjust in a few seconds. But the ocean does not wait a few seconds. A capsized boat does not wait. Drowning people do not wait. A young technician panicked and switched the channel to the Federal Maritime Safety Authority. Seconds later, the reply came. Short, sharp, nothing extra. Get Sam Whitaker now. The last 3 words fell over the coordination room like a stone. Anyone with experience understood immediately what that meant. When the federal authority calls for someone by name, the situation has passed the point of ordinary chaos. It means there is no time left for trial and error. Evan heard the order and went silent for 7 full seconds. I counted them in the recording. No typing, no commands, no sharp breaths, just the quiet of someone realizing for the first time that out on the ocean, a degree does not shield you from anything. When he finally spoke again, his voice shook. Not much, just enough to show that real fear had finally reached him. In that moment, I felt no satisfaction. Only the weight of seeing a young man thrown far too early into a battle he should have trained for through a few more seasons of wind. While the coordination room trembled with alarms, shouting, and overlapping radio calls, I stood in my own kitchen, listening to it all through my phone. The ocean had finally spoken. And this time it spoke not with gentle waves, but with wind gusts, burned-out radar, and a federal command pulling me back. I knew then that the final thread holding Evan upright had begun to fray. And the sea, as always, was preparing to teach a lesson no university could ever offer. I stepped into the backyard to hear the wind more clearly. Night in New England was cold enough to make you think your breath could freeze in midair. The waves hit the rocky shore in heavy, deliberate bursts. I stood at the edge of the porch, bracing my hands on the railing, trying to feel which way the storm had turned. I did not need radar. 28 years in this work were enough to know when the ocean was truly angry. And when the ocean was angry, it usually demanded a price. The roar of an engine cut through the wind, headlights swept across the sand and stopped near the dock. I looked down and saw 2 figures running through the cold, one in a suit jacket whipping in the gusts, his tie flipped over his shoulder. The CEO of NACR, David Holbrook, looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He stumbled across the damp sand, shielding his face from the wind. A few steps behind him was Evan, shrinking into his coat, his face pale as if the blood had drained out of him. I had never seen Evan like that. Hair is a mess, eyes red, whether from exhaustion or fear, I could not tell. Every step he took was heavy, as if carrying something far bigger than he was ready for. And I knew exactly what it was. The storm had placed the entire weight of the ocean on shoulders that had never felt surf. Holbrook stopped in front of me, breathless. His shirt was soaked with seawater and sweat, his cheeks raw from the wind. He grabbed the railing like a man who had just outrun a fire. Sam. He said my name like it was the last life buoy in sight. I said nothing. I just looked at him, waiting for him to say the truth he had avoided for months. Sam, we need you, he said through broken breaths. We truly need you. The situation out there is out of control. The radar is unstable, the model is behind the storm, and the rescue teams are waiting for clear orders. People could die if we cannot find direction. Evan stood behind him, eyes wide. In that look, I saw 3 things at once: fear, shame, awakening. He tried to say something, but the wind swallowed it whole. I leaned back against the railing, arms crossed. I did not let them see anger or grief, only the truth, a truth that required no defending. You thought Harvard was enough for my seat. Ask the ocean if it agrees. The line sliced through the cold like a blade. No one spoke. Holbrook lowered his head. Evan stared at his shoes buried in sand. Some lessons never appear in textbooks. Evan had just collided with his first one. Holbrook rested a hand on the railing. His voice dropped, stripped of the confident polish he wore in boardrooms. Sam, I am begging you. The federal authority is requesting you back. The helicopter almost went down. The tourist boat capsized, and the radio teams are in chaos. Just coordinate once, tonight. After that, we will renegotiate everything. Any conditions you want. I looked at him for a long moment. The wind carried the sharp scent of salt into my face, pulling up memories from thousands of shifts, and the memory from 2003, the night I lost the woman I loved because one order came 5 minutes too late. That pain kept me in this job. That pain taught me that sometimes you stand back up, even when your heart wants nothing more than to stay away from the place that once crushed it. I asked him, "What is the status of the capsized boat?" Holbrook glanced at Evan. The young man's voice cracked. 3 are still alive, 1 missing. The water temperature is dropping fast. If we cannot determine drift direction in 10 minutes. He stopped, unable to finish. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. The wind hammered against the porch frame. I could hear the ocean calling. People who have spent their lives in this work know that call. It is not exactly a sound, it is instinct. A stretch of water waiting for someone to come save it. A life measured in minutes. I opened my eyes. Right, I said, but I am not going back into your office. Not right now. Holbrook blinked. Sam, you need to be in the coordination center too. I shook my head. No need. From here, I can hear the ocean better than your systems can. Evan stared at me, stunned as if witnessing a miracle. But there was no miracle. Only 28 years of standing in the wind. I stepped down from the porch and walked toward my pickup truck. The wind pushed hard against my jacket. As I opened the door, I paused, looked back at them, and said one last thing. I will coordinate from here. I will give you the direction. But if I come back for good, we will talk after the storm. Because the old seat is no longer enough for someone who knows what I know. Holbrook did not understand right away. Evan understood first. He swallowed hard and took a step back as if something had struck him in the chest. I got into the truck, turned on my personal radio, and began scanning the frequencies. The ocean was still roaring, but there were gaps in the noise that only someone with years on the job could read. I closed one eye and listened. The direction was clear. I had not gone back yet. The cardboard HR box was still sitting on my kitchen table. But tonight the ocean needed me again. And I have never once turned away when the sea calls for a life. I turned on the radio inside the truck, the wind from the ocean mixing with thick static. But even through all that noise, I could hear the details that mattered. The wind level was dropping. The current was pushing northeast. The helicopter had lost altitude and regained it. Years of experience let me see the whole picture from broken bits of sound. I asked the helicopter captain for wind humidity based on feel. Asked the patrol boat to judge wave direction by sight instead of radar. Each answer was enough for me to know where they were and how the accident was shifting. I told them to shift their search 2 nautical miles northeast, completely different from what the model predicted. No one argued. In moments like that, theory steps aside for survival instinct. 20 minutes later, the helicopter reported a white flash amid the dark sea. All 3 survivors were still clinging to the overturned hull. The 4th was found a short distance away. All 4 were still breathing. That alone was enough to make the entire coordination room exhale like waking from a nightmare. When the mission stabilized, Holbrook tapped on my truck window. The wind pressed his jacket tight to his body. Evan followed behind, head lowered, looking like someone who had just walked through a storm far too big for him. Holbrook did not waste time. Sam, we need you to come back. We need you in command. The federal authority made it clear. Only you can keep tonight under control. Name your terms. I looked at him, then at Evan. There was no satisfaction on my face. Only the plain truth of this job. I spoke slowly, making sure they heard every word. If I come back, the rules change. Holbrook nodded immediately, though his jaw tightened slightly, like a man about to sign something he had no choice but to accept. First, I want my old position back with full authority, not just in title. In rescue work, when reality contradicts a model, final decisions belong to the person who understands the ocean, not the algorithm. Second, I want expanded coordination rights and a real training budget. We have relied on polished reports for too long. I need authority to inspect equipment, demand maintenance, and report directly to the federal authority when vendors start playing games. Third, Evan stays on the team. He will follow me for 6 months of fieldwork, not learning from books, but by standing on deck with the wind hitting him straight in the face, by hearing helicopter rotors shake under crosswinds, by learning the difference between a true swell and reflected waves. I said it plainly. Harvard does not teach this part. The ocean will. Evan swallowed hard, but he nodded. The honesty in that nod earned my respect. Fourth, management must publicly acknowledge its mistake, not because my pride needs healing, but because the rescue crews out there deserve the truth. Their experience was misjudged, and the cost tonight nearly became human lives. If that lesson is not spoken aloud, it will be buried immediately. Holbrook looked at me for a long moment, then nodded again. You will have all of it, Sam. We were wrong. We will fix it. Evan stood beside him, eyes still red from stress. His voice was quiet but steady. I want to learn. I thought I understood how the ocean worked. Tonight showed me I only understood a small piece of it. I opened the truck door and stepped out onto the wet sand. The cold wind slapped my face, but I had lived with that cold for decades. I told them to head back to the center. Tonight I would return to the coordination room, but not to continue what they were doing, to rebuild everything from the ground up. When I walked into NACR headquarters, the room fell silent. Everyone who had worked with me for years stood up on instinct. I motioned for them to sit. No ceremony. We were still in the storm. Blue Future 2.0 still glowed across an entire wall. I did not shut it down or throw it away. I moved it to a side screen, a reference tool, not a decision maker. On the main wall, I put up the old paper map, a map you could adjust with a pencil where you could draw wind directions by intuition, where you could mark things no model would ever recognize. On the whiteboard, I sketched the wind paths for the next 6 hours, based on what I heard on the radio minutes earlier. I pointed to a stretch of water where radar often scrambled and told the helicopter captain to avoid it for the entire night. No one argued. They understood why I knew things the screens could not show. Evan stood beside me with a notebook in hand. He asked how I knew the wind would shift in that spot. I listened to the radio for one more beat. The wind tightened. The waves flattened slightly. I pointed at the map, because I have heard it shift like that 3 times before. And tonight, it is doing it the exact same way. He said nothing. He just bent over his notebook and wrote. This time not to justify a theory, but to learn something real. Within a few hours, the operation was reorganized. We used manual radio calls, short orders, clear and unquestioned. The helicopter routes were set along 2 wind paths to guarantee an escape line. The patrol boats moved in the formation we had trained for nearly 20 years. When the capsized boat was finally pulled into the harbor, all 4 survivors were conscious. The coordination room exhaled as one single body. No cheering, no applause. We simply looked at each other and bowed our heads. That is how sea people mark a victory. No noise, no bragging, just a quiet understanding that we survived one more night against nature. Evan stood by the window watching the docks below. Then he turned to me and said softly, "Sir, I think the 3rd condition should last longer than 6 months. I have too much left to learn." I looked out at the vast black ocean. The ocean is the toughest teacher. But it teaches well if you are willing to stand in the wind long enough. And in that moment, I knew a new chapter for the rescue team had truly begun. I stayed at the center until the radio finally went silent. After a night when people nearly died, I could never walk away. Most of the team had gone home. Only a few silhouettes were still packing up equipment. Evan sat at the last desk, flipping through his notebook as if unsure what else to write. He still carried the look of someone who had just discovered that the distance between theory and reality was wider than the ocean outside. I asked the tech crew to load the radar data from the past 36 hours. The moment it came up, I saw exactly what bothered me. The wind direction was slightly off from what we heard on the radio. Not by much, but in rescue work, not by much can still cost a life. I opened the regional lighthouse signal chart. The blinking markers looked normal at first glance. But when I magnified the cycle timing of a few of them, the same problem surfaced again. The Cape Armitage light, the most important beacon when storms erase the horizon, was flashing slightly slower than standard. Just a fraction. But it had been doing it for 3 straight years. I called Evan over. He stood beside me, cautious, but without the attitude of a young man who thinks he already knows. I pointed to the signal pattern. This light has been out of rhythm for 3 years. No one checked it. Evan frowned and flipped through vendor reports. The paperwork stated clearly that all beacons were functioning at standard levels. He compared last year's data, then the year before that. "Could this be weather-related?" he asked. I tilted my head. If it were weather, it would change with the seasons. This one ticks off beat like a clock that has been wrong for years. And the worst part, people trusted the paperwork more than the reality. Evan did not argue. He stared at the data for a long time, as if searching for an excuse to soften the truth, then gave up. I opened my logbook, the same book I had carried for 28 years. On a page from 3 years ago, I had written a few short notes. Armitage beacon is slightly slow. Small irregularity. Monitor long-term. Evan compared it to old radar readings, then looked up, his face a shade paler. They match perfectly. I nodded. Because the ocean does not know how to lie, but paperwork does. He stayed quiet for a while, then spoke honestly without hiding behind pride. I trusted spreadsheets more than someone's handwritten notes. Maybe I was wrong. It was the first thing he said all day that told me he was finally learning the real trade. I asked for checks on 2 other lighthouses. One had a distorted cycle pattern. Another showed dimming brightness. The vendor blamed environmental factors. But if the environment had changed, why did the light sensor placed right next to it record nothing? Evan was the one who asked that question. And that was when I knew he no longer saw this work as a data problem. We laid everything out on the table. Lighthouse signals, old radar logs, sensor data, my logbook, vendor, reports. When placed together, the picture was obvious. Faulty equipment, beautified reports, and worse, a year-long deviation no one noticed because everyone believed anything new must be correct. Evan exhaled sharply, as if he finally understood why that beautiful model had dragged us to the edge of disaster during the storm. If the helicopter last night had relied fully on the Armitage beacon, I looked at him. They would have flown nearly a nautical mile off course, enough to never see the overturned boat. He dropped into the chair, covering his face with both hands. Maybe for the first time, he felt the weight of a job where responsibility did not live in presentations, but in small details people overlook. After a long pause, he asked, "You found all these issues by yourself over the years?" I answered quietly, "No one found anything. They were looking at screens. I was looking at the ocean." A moment later, he stood up and moved beside my desk, speaking with more resolve than I had ever heard from him. "I want to handle this with you, not just because of my mistake, but I think I need to understand this job the right way." I closed the logbook. Outside, the Cape Armitage light kept blinking through the fog, looking normal, harmless even. But I knew that harmless look was the real danger. It lulled people into sleep. I placed all the documents into a large folder. "All right. But remember this, Evan. If we go all the way, this will not stay a technical report. It will hit budgets, contracts, and reputations. You still want in." Evan looked at me, for the first time without a trace of the Harvard pride he carried on his first day. "I do, because this time I am not learning for a degree. I am learning to save lives." I nodded. That was the only answer I needed. And I knew then that the real storm waiting for us was not the one from last night. It was the one hidden inside those harmless lighthouse beams waiting to be dragged into the light. I sent the entire lighthouse file to the Federal Maritime Safety Office at dawn. Just one email, no commentary. The numbers spoke for themselves. I was about to finish my coffee when my phone rang nonstop. "Mr. Sam Whitaker, we reviewed the data. We need you in Washington by tonight. No follow-up questions." When the federal office uses that tone, it means the problem has grown far beyond a single stretch of coastline. At headquarters, they brought me straight into the conference room. On the large screen were 3 years of lighthouse signal charts. Deviations are scattered across the entire network. None large enough to raise alarms on their own, but together they formed a coordinated pattern of malfunction. The 3 biggest equipment vendors in the region were officially marked as under suspicion. One member of the committee tapped my logbook. "These notes are the only markers that help us determine when the deviation started." I answered, "I only wrote what the ocean showed me." They began discussing the scope of the investigation. If the signaling network were compromised, the entire North Atlantic transportation system would have to be reassessed. Commercial routes, fishing routes, and even military corridors depended on those beacons. A small deviation in one tower could become a nautical mile of error by the time you reach the 8th. After nearly an hour, the committee head turned to me. "NACR will lead the full restructuring of the North Atlantic signaling network. We want you to take the position of North Atlantic Chief Safety Advisor." I am not easily surprised, but it took me a few breaths. I never aimed for a title. I just knew this job required someone who had stood in the wind long enough to know when the ocean was telling the truth and when it was silent because something was wrong. I accepted. Evan sat in the back row, no longer wearing the youthful confidence he used to. He understood now just how severe the situation was. Not just a near disaster in last night's storm, but the realization that the entire system we trusted might have been quietly altered for reasons that were far from clean. When the meeting ended, Evan and I stepped into the glass hallway. He stood still for a moment, wrestling with something. Then he spoke softly. I am sorry. Not because anyone told me to say it, but because I truly see now that I misunderstood this profession. I want to learn the right way. Under you. If you will allow it. I looked at him. The pride he once carried was gone. What stood in front of me was a young man finally understanding the weight of the job he had claimed to know. All right, but remember, this is not a 6-month course. In this profession, there is no graduation day. He nodded, a small nod, but sincere. That afternoon, NACR held a full team meeting. The room was tense. Rumors of a federal investigation had spread faster than expected. Holbrook stepped up first, followed by the entire management board. This time, none of them, avoided their employees' eyes. Holbrook spoke slowly with no attempt to excuse anything. We were wrong to value polished models over real experience. Wrong to hand command to someone who did not yet understand the ocean. And the storm nearly made us pay with our lives. Starting today, NACR will restructure under Mr. Whitaker's guidance. The room went silent, not the awkward kind, the kind that comes after people have seen real danger. I stepped forward. I did not want this meeting to turn into a place where we reopen wounds just to point fingers. I needed the team to understand why these changes mattered. We are not fixing mistakes to protect pride. We are fixing them to protect lives. Technology helps us. But the ocean does not negotiate. If we miss one small detail, it will hit back with a bigger one. The veterans nodded. They had stood in the wind long enough to understand. Evan sat in the front row, eyes locked on me. In them, I saw humility that had not been there before. Not fear, growth, the kind only born after facing a real mistake. After the meeting, I walked out of the center. Cold winds swept across the docks. Far out, the Cape Armitage beacon blinked steadily through the fog, as if it had never led any vessel astray. But this time, I did not see it as a threat. I saw it as a reminder that even the brightest signals can be distorted if you never check them with your own eyes and ears. And I knew this. The investigation had only begun. The storm from last night was just the opening act. The real storm lived inside the contracts, the polished reports, and the signatures that had forced the ocean to speak on our behalf. Sam Whitaker did not return just to coordinate rescues. I came back to rebuild an entire system, and this time I was not doing it alone. My new office sat on the 7th floor, facing the rocky point where the waves of the North Atlantic slammed into shore like an endless exhale. The glass wall was so wide that if I stood still for a few seconds, I could hear the wind slipping through the frame, just like the nights I spent on duty 20 years ago. This was the same stretch of water that took my wife in 2003, the same stretch that gave me the chance to save more than 180 lives. I have never known whether to thank it or blame it. Maybe neither. The ocean is neither friend nor enemy. It is simply the ocean. On my desk, my logbook lay open to the very last page. 28 years, nearly without missing a day. From fog seasons so thick even the lighthouse looked like a ghost, to storm seasons when helicopters vibrated like they were about to fall apart. The final page was still blank, waiting for a single sentence I had been wrestling with for a week. I picked up my pen and sat in the chair that still smelled like new leather. The sky outside darkened. The Armitage light blinked at the correct rhythm, steady and reassuring. Part of the reform was complete, not because of any system, but because the team had finally embraced the rule we set. Measure again, check again, never underestimate small deviations. At last, I wrote the line I had wanted to write since the storm. The ocean does not care where you went to school. It only cares what you do when the wind changes, just one line. But for me, it held the entire philosophy of this work. No one is saved by beautiful terminology. People survive because someone acts at the right moment. I had barely set the pen down when I heard a soft knock. Evan stepped inside, no longer wearing the taut expression of a fresh Harvard graduate. He stood straight, not rushed, not restless like before, just standing there, calm, knowing he was starting over in a profession that does not forgive easily. "Mr. Whitaker," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I just want to say one thing. Thank you for not leaving me behind." I leaned back in my chair, arms folded. Evan now looked nothing like the young man who once measured office space to set up a new coordination system. His first true lesson had come not in a presentation, but in the wind hammering a helicopter in the dark. Real growth never comes from degrees. It comes from the moment you realize you know far less than you thought. I said, "I kept you because you were willing to learn. That is something many of your age cannot do." Evan sat across from me. He stared out at the sea for a long while, as if trying to hear something out there. Then he asked, "Have you ever thought about leaving this work?" I gave him a faint smile. A question every rescuer who has done this more than half a lifetime has asked themselves. I glanced at the open logbook. Every page is filled with the smell of wind, the sound of waves, and sometimes tears. "Plenty of times," I answered. "But every time I think of walking away, the ocean pulls me back. Not with promises, but it always needs someone who can keep others safe." Evan nodded, understanding at least a part of it. He did not ask more. Sometimes silence is its own kind of respect. I closed the logbook, hearing the soft snap like the closing of a long chapter. An era ending. Not because I was tired, but because I knew my time leading from the front was over. Now it was the next generation's turn. People like Evan, carrying a humility I hoped they would never lose. I placed the logbook in the drawer. For the first time in years, I did not slip it into my coat pocket out of habit. It had fulfilled its purpose. It recorded everything the ocean had taught me. The rest was for someone else to learn. Evan stood to leave. Before stepping out, he turned back. "I want to write my own logbook someday, but I think I need time to hear the ocean first." "Good," I said. "Listen first, then write. No one writes a logbook with imagination." He smiled, a strong, honest smile, free of the earlier awkwardness. Then he left. I turned back to the sea one last time that day. Below, the lighthouse beams blinked in perfect rhythm, as if they had never gone wrong. The wind shifted lightly, tapping against the glass with a familiar sound. Maybe years from now, people will forget about the corrupt vendors, forget the storm that nearly pulled a helicopter into the ocean. But I hope they will not forget the most important truth. Humans are still the final guardians of safety. I turned off the office lights, leaving the glow of the ocean to fill the empty room. If you are still reading, I want to leave you with a small message. One thing I wish someone had told me when I first started. When the wind changes, you choose to be an observer or an actor. And the difference between those two can be a life. And before I close this story, let me ask you one thing. If you value stories about truth, courage, and the kind of turnarounds that still hold humanity at their core, subscribe to the channel for the next chapter. Thank you for walking this journey with me.